Okay, let's see who's all here. Uh-oh. All right. We'll see if anyone else shows up, but meanwhile, we will get started. All right, so this is our last class session. I'll remind you guys that final papers are due a week from today, on Thursday, August 22nd, via email. And you'll see the email, there's an email listed on the syllabus. There's also an email address listed on the writing assignment itself, so either of those will work. So please send it to me that way rather than through the Canvas, so I don't have to log on to Canvas to get the paper. Also, please send it to me either in PDF or Microsoft Word, not Pages. So Apple Pages I won't be able to look at. I won't be able to read those. So either Microsoft Word or PDF. I would also prefer that you send me the file attachment, the paper, rather than share a Google Doc with me. So that, again, I don't have to log into Google to access it. So, like I said, email to either of those. There's a UChicago email address and there's an saic.edu email address. By next Thursday, the 22nd. All right. So we have several essays to look at tonight by Adorno from the last year of his life, from 1968 to 1969. And I wanted to give some historical background on that. So you guys may or may not know, 1968 is a major year in terms of political history. It's a kind of a crisis year throughout the world. There are student protests in various countries throughout the world. There are also other kinds of uprisings that take place. So in May of 1968, there's a student protest that eventually becomes a more general protest in Paris, in France. In the United States, also, around the Democratic National Convention, which is happening in Chicago next week. In Chicago of that year, also in 1968, there were protests against the Vietnam War in particular. And there was the Prague Spring. So in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, there was a Soviet intervention to stop a liberalization of the Communist Party regime in Czechoslovakia. Also, there was a protest in Mexico City by students ahead of the Olympics that year, in which the students were massacred by the government. And there are other incidents that take place throughout the world, but those are some examples of what's going So I mentioned that in the United States, there's a protest against the Vietnam War. Throughout the world, the left and student movements are also protesting against the Vietnam War, against the U.S. Intervention in Vietnam. So this includes in Germany, where Adorno was. So the German student movement had started earlier. So I will trace back some history that will be pertinent. So in 1953, Joseph Stalin died. And there was actually an uprising that took place in East Germany in 1953 that was suppressed. Bertolt Brecht, who we read a poem to posterity, wrote another poem, a kind of a witticism, kind of little aphoristic poem, in which he said, "The Central Committee has convened and decided to elect a new people." All right, so kind of reversing the idea of the people electing the Central Committee. No, the Central Committee is going to elect a new people because the Central Committee was disappointed with the people because the people had risen up. In 1956, the new leader of the Soviet Communist Party, the Communist Party of the USSR, and leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a speech denouncing Stalin. And it was a secret speech, but it was not really a secret speech. So it was a secret speech to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but it was meant to get out into the wider realm, into the wider communist movement, and then into the wider world, internationally. So he condemned Stalin for crimes against the revolution, crimes against Leninism, crimes against socialism. And this had a huge impact in the international communist movement. It eventually led to the division between communist China and the Soviet Union. He also Khrushchev accused Stalin of revisionism. So we've looked a little bit at the revisionist dispute in the history of Marxism. That term revisionism is a kind of loaded term. It doesn't simply mean revising Marxism in any particular way, but it means revising Marxism in a reformist way, in a way that is adapting to continued capitalism. So in the Sino-Soviet split, Mao and Khrushchev made this accusation against each other. So they both accused each other of revisionism, meaning abandoning the cause of socialism or communism, abandoning the revolution, and adopting a reformist perspective for adapting to continued capitalism. And so the Sino-Soviet split between Soviet Union and Communist China was about competition over the leadership of the international communist movement. That same year, the non-aligned movement that was trying to, basically as the post-colonial states, the newly independent states coming out of decolonization, the countries that did not want to be on the side of either the West or the East in the Cold War. So they neither wanted to be on the side of the communist East or the capitalist West in the Cold War. It's called the Bandung Conference and in Indonesia. And it is meant to, again, offer an alternative to the Cold War. I should also say that the Middle East had a crisis, and that was the Suez Crisis. So the the Suez Canal had been controlled by the UK, by the British, and Egypt, under an ostensibly revolutionary nationalist regime, under Nasser, had seized the Suez Canal. And in that context, the UK, France, and Israel invaded to seize control of the Suez Canal back away from the Egyptians. When this happened, the Soviet Union threatened to nuke Britain and France if they didn't withdraw. And the United States said to Britain and France, we're not going to protect you. And so they had to accept Egyptian control over the Suez Canal. Another incident that took place was a liberalization of the communist regime in Hungary. Also, a move in a similar direction in Poland. In Poland, this move towards a liberalization of the communist regime was blocked internally, politically, within the Communist Party itself. In Hungary, things got more out of control, and the Soviet Union invaded to suppress an uprising in Hungary. So there had been a suppression of the uprising in East Germany by the Germans, with Soviet help, of course. In Poland, it didn't come to a military kind of operation, but in Hungary it did. It was a Soviet intervention to put down the uprising in Hungary. And like I said later on, the Prague Spring is also put down militarily by Soviet intervention in 1968. But 56, the reason I talked about the events in 1956 is that this could be seen as the beginning of the New Left that really flowered in the 1960s. It is a crisis of the official communist movement, the official communist parties throughout the world, and I mentioned the Sino-Soviet split. It led to the splitting of the communist parties throughout the world into Maoist offshoots, including in the United States. So in the United States, a faction of the Communist Party split off and followed Mao, and the rest stayed and followed Khrushchev. And that happened throughout the world. It happened in India, it happened in the Middle East. It didn't happen in Western Europe so much. It was a much or the UK. It was much more of a narrowly defined phenomenon. So fewer people were involved, but it was a split in the communist movement, and that in the non-aligned movement seemed to create a space for a new left that was not constrained to the Cold War framework. In Germany, in West Germany, where Adorno was located after World War II, so he and Horkheimer went back to West Germany after World War II, there was a division that was taking place within the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the anti-communist socialist party that had a very significant base in the working class. I should also say that in East Germany after World War II, the Communist Party and the Social Democrats in East Germany united. And so the ruling party in East Germany was called the Socialist Unity Party, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. In West Germany, they outlawed the Communist Party, and the SPD was there. But the SPD started making moves to officially renounce Marxism. And when they did that, the student group for the Social Democratic Party split off from the mother party, from the main party. Interestingly enough, they were the SDS in Germany, but it stands for something different than what began in the United States, the Students for a Democratic Society, new student movement. In Germany, though, in West Germany, Horkheimer and Adorno were sympathetic to the students who had split from the SPD, sympathetic to the student movement. There was a scandal in the early 60s where the conservative government, the Christian Democratic government, because the Christian Democrats ruled Germany after World War II, several key cabinet members in the Christian Democratic government in West Germany were discovered to be secret East German agents. So major ministers in the West German government were discovered to be secretly communist agents operating on behalf of East Germany. And so this caused a panic in West German politics, and they instituted what were known as the emergency laws. And the emergency laws allowed a kind of extrajudicial, extraordinary measure, emergency measure, government state repression against dissidents, specifically against leftist and communist dissidents, but against dissidents in general. And when the SPD did not oppose the emergency laws being implemented, so they were the opposition party, but they did not oppose this, that's really what cemented the separation of the students from the mother party. And it's really what got the student movement kicked off, is opposition to the emergency laws. And Adorno and Horkheimer supported the students. They opposed the emergency laws, and they supported the students in their protests against the emergency laws. Horkheimer and Adorno, I'm not sure if I included this on Canvas. It's not in our syllabus readings. Let me see if I did include it. There's a conversation that they had in 1956 that's recorded between the two of them that was translated into English and published several years back. Well, actually almost 15 years ago now. It's published as Towards a New Manifesto. It was recorded, transcribed as the discussion on theory and practice. Yeah, I don't think that I did include that. I might be able to. I might be able to send this to the. I'll upload it to our. Just make sure that it's not here. Yeah. So they were thinking about writing a new communist manifesto in 1956, given the crisis that was occurring. And then they abandoned that project because they said there was no audience for it. There's no audience for it in Germany. There's no audience for it in the UK or the United States. There's no audience for it in the East or the Soviet Union or China. The only place that there might be an audience is in France and Italy, because they had large communist parties with a mass base in the working class. But even there, they'd have a hard time finding a hearing. So they basically abandoned the project. But they said that they want to rewrite the Communist Manifesto for the 20th century and after the experience of the Russian Revolution and fascism, but also Stalinization of the communist movement and World War II and the Holocaust, etc. But they said it would have to be still a strictly Leninist manifesto. But they abandoned that idea and didn't ultimately write it. But it was foreshadowing the crisis and the new left that came out of that crisis in the later 1950s and early 1960s. Finally, there's another event that takes place in the year before these readings. So our readings are from 1968, 1969 for tonight. The Shah of Iran visited West Germany in 1967, and the students protested against the Shah's visit, and a student was killed by the police. And this was a sort of a major event And Adorno, among other people, said that the police killing of the student protester showed that fascism was still alive and well in West Germany. So this is just some background. So what happens in 1968, especially around things like there's a communist offensive in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, that shows the vulnerability of the American forces. And this, triggers, it's meant to trigger, and it does trigger more protests throughout the world, especially in the United States. But there's a frustration with the student movement, its ineffectiveness, its inability to affect government policy regarding the Vietnam War. In Germany, it leads towards a turn into a terrorist direction. Also in Italy, so the Red Army faction in West Germany. In the United States, there's a division in the student movement, in the Students for a Democratic Society, into splinters. The main organization is taken over by Maoists, and the splinter groups are called Revolutionary Youth Movement. There's Revolutionary Youth Movement 1 and Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. Out of that split of the Students for a Democratic Society comes the Weather Underground, which is a terrorist group. But they also organize, so they do some bombings, but they also organize on a clandestine underground level. They organize the Days of Rage, which are street protests that happen in various cities in the United States. So there's a turn that happens in 1968 in the New Left, in which there's a great deal of frustration, there's a sense of impasse, and that causes a radicalization to take place. In Frankfurt, where Adorno and Horkheimer are, the students see themselves as being inspired by the Frankfurt School to some extent, to be inspired by critical theory. And at least to a certain extent, there's a faction of the student movement that sees themselves as inspired by Frankfurt School critical theory. But then they're upset that the critical theory people themselves, the critical theorists themselves, Horkheimer and Adorno, and also their student, Jürgen Habermas, are more critical of the students, especially critical of the students' tactics. So there's a kind of a division that occurs between the Frankfurt School critical theorists and their students. The protesters who consider themselves to be their students but feel betrayed by them, feel betrayed by their teachers. One of the ways that they protest against Horkheimer and Adorno at the University of Frankfurt, where they teach, is to create huge reproductions of texts and drape them over the facades of buildings, turning them into sort of slogans in order to shame them. So we read The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom. That's from a larger collection of aphorisms called the Dämmerung, Dawn or Twilight, Dawn or Dusk, Dämmerung. And there are other aphorisms where Horkheimer writes about how, a Marxist doesn't belong in a seminar room, but on the street, risking their lives. So, from the late 1920s and early 1930s, so they use Horkheimer and Adorno's own writings to kind of shame them, to try to embarrass them, to say that they've gone against their own insights, their own writings. They've turned against their own Marxism because they're not supporting the students in their turn to a more militant, radical action in 1968. So that's the primary background for three of the writings that we read for tonight, namely Subject and Object, Marginality to Theory and Praxis, and The Resignation. Late capitalism or industrial society is a speech that Adorno gave, he wrote and gave for the German Sociological Association. So Adorno was a professor of sociology as well as a professor of philosophy. So looking at negative dialectics, we dealt with some of Adorno's critical theory of philosophy, critique of philosophy, immanent dialectical critique of philosophy. But he also engaged in a critique of sociology, an immanent dialectical critique of sociology, of classical bourgeois sociology, and of more 20th century, more scientific research sociology. Sociological theory and sociological research. The article that we read, Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, he had it translated into English and published the same year, in 1968, in the United States. And the title he gave it in the English translation was, Is Marx Obsolete? But the answer to the question was no. Right, so he poses that in Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, he takes up that issue. And in substance, his answer is no. The title in the English language publication from that year was more straight to the point. But Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, those are the categories for the immanent dialectical critique of a social theory of capitalism or a social theory of modern society, of contemporary social theory or sociological theory of modern society in his time. So it gives you the two sides of the contradictory appearance. What does modern capitalist society look like in the post-World War II world? The term industrial society has several different sources, but one important source is from an American social theorist, political theorist, sociologist, Danielle Bell, who was a research assistant at the Frankfurt School when they were at Columbia University in New York during World War II, and who was around the Trotskyist movement. But he's famous in the 1950s for the end of ideology thesis. So the end of ideology thesis is that the 20th century is no longer going to be characterized by the ideological struggles that characterized the world coming out of the 19th century. And the reason for this is that despite any kind of ideological propaganda, that it's really lost its substance, because underneath the Cold War ideological struggle, actually there was a convergence. So it's also known, the end of ideology thesis is one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is the convergence thesis, where the Soviet Union and the United States, the West and the East, were converging historically, becoming more similar than different as industrial society. So it didn't make sense to talk about the capitalist West and the socialist East, that really both were industrial society. Neither were socialist, but also neither were capitalist in the traditional sense, and that this involved really evacuating the substance out of the ideological struggle. That it was a function rather of convergence in industrial society. And Bell and others, his cohort, and others influenced by him, what they said was that rather than the contradiction in society being the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production, the contradiction now was between an economizing logic and a sociologizing logic. In other words, a social logic of economic efficiency and a social logic of socialization. So the idea is that the direction that society takes to realize more of an economic efficiency is actually a kind of a antisocial direction that cuts against, nonetheless, society is also moving in the direction of increased socialization. Right, so at the heart of modern society, whether in the East or the West, whether in the capitalist bloc or the socialist bloc, is the same. The contradiction is not between private property and industrial production. The contradiction is between the economizing logic and the sociologizing logic. One is atomizing and one is a more collectivizing. So the economizing logic is atomizing, it's disintegrating society, and the socializing logic is binding people together. So he and other social theorists in the mid-20th century were conceiving of what they called a post-bourgeois form of capitalism. Or it's not even capitalism at all. It's rather industrial society. So that's the background for Adorno's discussion. So Adorno taking up this contradiction between late capitalism or industrial society, that's where those concepts are coming from. Those are not original to him. Late capitalism is another non-original concept. It's a concept of imperialist capitalism, so late capitalism, spate capitalism, is a concept shared by Marxists and non-Marxists in the pre-World War I, but also in World War I and immediately after World War I. So the idea is that this is a kind of a late capitalism. Lateness meaning not in its kind of heroic paradigmatic phase, which would be sort of mid-19th century phase, but rather a kind of decayed form of capitalism, late capitalism. Marxists called it the imperialist phase of capitalism. We talked about this a bit. Lenin called it imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So a form of capitalism that is financialized and exhibits monopolization and a great deal of state control and administration. So it's a kind of a late phase capitalism. And the way Lenin and other Marxists understood that was that it was the highest possible stage of capitalism. It was the prelude to socialist revolution. Ernest Mandel, who was the leader of the Trotskyist movement in the world after World War II, after Trotsky's death, he's a Belgian Trotskyist who fought in the resistance against the Nazis. He wrote and published a book in that same year of 1968 called Late Capitalism. Right, again, trying to grasp the significance of 20th century developments in capitalism. Finally, I will say that people around both the Trotskyist movement in the United States and the Frankfurt School during their American exile had formulated a different conception of statified capitalism, of state capitalism. One in particular, James Burnham, who was an American socialist who was briefly in the Trotskyist movement but broke with them, he wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution, where he said that capitalism was not being overcome by proletarian socialism, but rather was being overcome in a kind of technocratic management. The Frankfurt School had their own way of approaching this in the late 1930s and 1940s. They called it the administered society and the authoritarian state. So these are ideas that the Frankfurt School had collectively developed and that Adorno is still invoking as late as 1968. Right, so that's, the kind of background. And it would have different political implications. So these different characterizations would have different political prognoses built into them. Right, that's the idea anyway. The idea is that the implication would be quite different about the direction, right, of society. So what we will see is that he, in the Late Capitalism essay, the subtitle for it, the fundamental question of the present structure of society. And present structure of society also meaning tendency of society, historical tendency, the prognosis for the further historical development of the society. But again, if we keep in mind the other title that he gave this essay, is Marx obsolete? The answer to which is no. Then the question is, how is Marx still relevant? How is Marxism or a Marxist approach still relevant? And of course it has to do with the contradiction. It has to do with a dialectical approach. Right, so the fact that in a new and different way, society no longer seems to be capitalist in the traditional Marxist understanding of that. However, there are two different ways that one can go regarding that he's finding in his contemporary moment: industrial society and late capitalism. Right, which raises the question of, do either of these challenge the validity of a Marxist approach? They might, depending on how one understands what a Marxist approach is. But Adorno's response to this is to take a Marxist approach to the question of the obsolescence of Marxism, or the obsolescence of Marx. So what would a kind of Marxian approach to the question of Marx's own obsolescence be? Right, so what that means is looking for the contradiction. And he kind of runs through the different ways that Marxism had traditionally characterized capitalism and the ways that those traditional characterizations of capitalism had been challenged by historical developments. For instance, the so-called immiseration thesis, the idea that the working class would become more and more immiserated, become more and more impoverished. Also, that there would be a tendency of the rate of profit to decline. In other words, capitalism would become less and less profitable over time. And he says, neither of these have seemed to come true in the way that is straightforwardly predicted, apparently, by Marx. And yet, both of these prognoses might have come true in a way unanticipated by Marx. And he does turn more in the direction from not only 1844 manuscripts and the Grundrisse, but also Das Kapital, alienation. Also, he brings in a little bit of Freudian psychoanalytic theory to talk about the question of ideology, meaning, does the failure of the socialist movement to overcome capitalism, does that invalidate the theory? Does it also present the question of ideology in a new and different way? And what would it mean to say that ideology is now showing up more at an individual psychological level than at a mass political level? So if we keep the definition of ideology that we've encountered before, false consciousness, but not really false consciousness, true consciousness, but self-contradictory consciousness. Right, that could show up in the form of bourgeois political economy, the labor theory of value, labor as value in production and in production in the exchange, of goods that keeps production going. The exchange of labor as a commodity itself. Right, so there's that way in which a bourgeois consciousness in both theory and practice might become false consciousness, self-contradictory. There's also political ideology. So there's not only political economy, there's also at the level of politics, and we've addressed some of that in terms of Marx starting out as a critic, as an imminent dialectical critic of the socialist or communist movement of his time, and how that continued to inform Marxism when it itself took the theoretical or strategic, or even we might call it ideological leadership of the socialist movement, and developed divisions within itself that could themselves be understood as something requiring an imminent dialectical critique. That the crisis in Marxism that Lukacs and Korsch talked about itself required a dialectical approach to comprehend. So a Marxist critique of Marxism, Marxist critique of the history of Marxism, a Marxist critique of the historical development and seeming result and fate of Marxism. And finally, we did the last couple of class sessions look at the third dimension, which is philosophy. Namely, what is the philosophical aftermath of German idealism? What's the philosophical aftermath in capitalism of bourgeois philosophy at its purportedly highest development, namely German idealist philosophy, or modern idealist philosophy, Kant and Hegel. Right, so all of these are forms of bourgeois consciousness in crisis, in self-contradiction and crisis. They're all domains of false consciousness. They're all domains of ideology. But again, not just wrong-headedness, not just thinking the wrong way or wrong ideas, false consciousness in that sense, but rather contradictory consciousness. So that we have Marx's critique of political economy in Das Kapital, we have Marx and Engels, their critique of socialism, followed by later Marxists who have a critique of their own movement, so Luxemburg and Lenin as critics of their own Marxist movement of their time. And then finally, we have Adorno's attempt to do the critique of philosophy, following from Lukacs and Korsch, who are themselves following from Marx and Engels in their early development in the 1840s. All right, so all these are forms of ideology. All of them call for ideology critique. All of them call for this imminent dialectical critique. Right, so Adorno is trying to uphold that. And again, it's at a fairly late stage. So it is 50 years after the Russian Revolution. It's more than 50 years after the Russian Revolution. It's 50 years after the German Revolution that broke out in 1918. And yet the New Left is reaching for Marx again. Reaching back into the history of Marxism again. So Adorno and the other Frankfurt School members, people like Horkheimer and Marcuse, are uniquely situated as thinkers, albeit at some remove from politics, who nonetheless had gone through an earlier phase of radicalization in the 1930s. Right, so they're kind of bridging these two moments, the pre-World War II moment and the post-World War II moment. The moment of the old left and the moment of the new left. And broadly understood, Adorno and the other Frankfurt School members do see developments in fields such as academic sociology as bearing the traces of as showing the effects of the long historical failure of the socialist movement. Right, that you could look at the question of how to theorize contemporary society, and especially in a new left context where people are reaching for Marx again, but they're wondering how Marx might or might not apply to their time. How that in and of itself is a phenomenon that Adorno could take up for a dialectical critique. It's the Cold War context which importantly informs the essay. So he does talk about the threat of total annihilation, so the threat of mutual assured destruction, nuclear warfare, right, as an important context. However, as a phenomenal manifestation, in other words, as itself a phenomenon. So it's not that the Cold War is causing things to look a certain way, but maybe the Cold War itself is a symptom, is a phenomenon of this impasse, but also contradiction of capitalism. Right? That there's something about the concept of nuclear annihilation that seems to render literally the prevailing sense of nihilism in advanced capitalism. Right, so rather than saying, well, because there's the threat of nuclear war, people are feeling nihilistic, actually, no, it could be that people are feeling nihilistic and that's why they're willing to contemplate nuclear war. Right, that nuclear weapons might come out of this nihilism. The other phenomenon contemporaneous with the invention of nuclear weapons, of course, in World War II is the Holocaust. So Hiroshima and Auschwitz are both signs of this kind of nihilism. So again, it's not that people were made nihilistic by the Holocaust, it's rather maybe it came out of the nihilism of people in capitalism. That's what made the Holocaust possible. In the same way that the nihilism of capitalism had made nuclear warfare possible. Or even mass total war involving the massacre of civilians possible. Going back to World War I, but especially in World War II. And so he does use the phenomenon of the Cold War itself as an example. And he also calls it, so that's at a very macro level, at a very kind of basic existential level. At a micro level, he talks about the free-floating anxiety of individual psychology. That at an individual level, psychology manifests what he calls a free-floating anxiety. So a free-floating anxiety meaning an anxiety without any object. Just an anxiety at existing, an anxiety at living. Free-floating anxiety. As a symptom of capitalism. As another, again, on a micrological level, at the individual level, a symptom of the nihilism of capitalism. All right, so there's a sense of personal doom, there's also a sense of collective doom. That seems to be all-pervasive. Now, sociology, interestingly enough, had its origins much earlier in the 19th century. So in Germany, one of the most influential sociologists, classical sociologists, is Max Weber. And Weber is famous for his analysis of the relationship between Protestantism and Protestant theology and capitalism. He wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism. I might have mentioned Lukacs was in the intellectual circle of Max Weber, so he was a friend and student of Max Weber. And Weber had what was called the rationalization thesis that Lukacs takes up in his phenomenon of reification. The rationalization thesis is, again, this means-ends reversal, meaning that the means are rational, but the ends are irrational. So the rationalization of means has become an end in itself and has lost a sense of purpose, of actual ends. Like, for what are we doing this? And he associates that with capitalism. Weber. So Weber finds a fundamental nihilism in capitalism that he says won't end until the last ton of fossil fuel is burnt up. Won't even end then. But that's the way he puts it. So he puts it basically in some indefinite future that probably will never come, meaning capitalism is a kind of means-ends reversal in which the locomotive is just running full steam, going off the tracks without any terminus. The other classical sociologist is Émile Durkheim, who's a French sociologist. So there's French sociology, Émile Durkheim. And Durkheim got his start, we might say, in the study of suicide in modern society. So one of his first kind of major studies in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, is on suicide. And specifically suicide as a phenomenon of the middle and working class. But it's something pervasive in society. And as a new thing, meaning peasants didn't commit suicide, workers in bourgeois society didn't commit suicide. The people who committed suicide in traditional civilization were priests and nobility. And they would commit suicide as like a noble act to preserve their values. Right, so death before dishonor, death before blasphemy, death before turning to evil. Right, so to save your soul, you might kill yourself. But this was not something that the commoners did. It's not something that the peasants did. Suicide was a noble activity. It was a virtuous act. It was done to preserve the meaning of life. So suicide preserved the meaning of life. Whereas in modern society, in capitalism, it has the opposite value. That suicide both is an expression of and enacts a kind of meaninglessness of life. So suicide is motivated by a meaninglessness of life and seems to instantiate that meaninglessness. So again, another way of coming at nihilism. So for Adorno, what that means is that coming from disparate places, different traditions, but in the same historical period, sociology is invented in a number of different ways, and no matter which direction it's coming from or the ways that it's conducted, sociology has as its object of investigation the nihilism of modern society. Right? It aims to diagnose the nihilism of modern society. It also aims to do something, to offer something ameliorative, to address and overcome this nihilism. Weber not so much, but Durkheim most certainly. So Durkheim's answer to modern nihilism, he saw it as a pathology of transition. That's how Durkheim described it. It's a pathology of transition. He considered capitalism to be a transitional form, and nihilism was a symptom of that transition. So basically, moving from one value system to another value system, moving from whether a traditional civilizational, traditional religious value system, or even a traditional bourgeois value system, like a more artisanal, like a Renaissance humanist value system, to another value system that we don't know what it is yet, but through the industrial era it's understood that the Industrial Revolution, industrial capitalist society, was a crisis of traditional values, whether old religious traditional values or more modern bourgeois values, but that we were moving in the direction of a new society beyond this crisis. And he saw the solution in that being what he called professional ethics, meaning that people could, without relapsing back into a kind of medieval guild corporatism, a kind of medieval guild artisanal kind of ethos, that through voluntary association, people could embrace cooperatively professions that they can then change. So he understood labor unions this way. He understood, more middle-class professional organizations this way. And he understood the struggle for socialism this way. So he says, socialism could mean a kind of attempt to turn back the clock on capitalism and return to a kind of medieval corporatism. Or it could mean moving in the direction of what he calls organic solidarity. So moving from mechanical solidarity, the old caste system, in which everything has a fixed place and things work as like a mechanism, to something more organic in which the parts can change, can be in a flowing process of transformation. And he saw the socialist movement in the working class as ambivalent, that it could either be leading towards this more organic social future, or it could be pointing back to a kind of medieval guild system within a caste society. So Durkheim's a little bit more hopeful of the two kind of fathers of classical sociology. And of course for Adorno that means, okay, if that was the early 20th century, now getting into the late 20th century, what do these prognoses look like? Who seems to have been proven more true by historical developments? Durkheim or Weber, right? And it seems that Weber, the more pessimistic view, has borne out more than the optimistic view. And yet, there is still something of the Durkheim view that calls for redemption, calls for fulfillment. Right? That Durkheim does have a sense of the possibility of socialism in a way that Weber actually discounted that. He thought, no, capitalism has its own logic, it's going to resist any attempt to transform it into socialism. It has a kind of inexorable logic that will dominate people in perpetuity. And so it does seem like Weber has proven more true because socialism was not achieved. And again, someone like Danielle Bell sees the economizing logic of capitalism disintegrating society in a particularly nihilistic way, in the way that Weber saw. And yet it also seems that people are yearning for, striving towards a society beyond capitalism in a more Durkheimian view, right? So again, you can understand the birth of sociology and the ways that these sociological thinkers grasped capitalism as itself manifesting this contradiction in capitalism. Right, so he's good. These different forms of appearance, different phenomenal forms of the contradiction operating in his own time. So I mentioned Ernest Mandel, who had written about late capitalism and was trying to update the theory of imperialism from the early 20th century. And what Ernest Mandel kind of reestablished in a more orthodox Marxist way was that the basic contradiction of capitalism as a contradiction of value originating in labor in the production process, that still was operating, but that one needed a more long-term view to see the operation of it. So rather than thinking of it in terms of the business cycles, that there are also long waves of development that go beyond the shorter cycle of the boom-bust business crisis model, commercial crisis model. And Adorno is also, without directly addressing it, trying to speak to that view, that capitalism seems to have changed in major ways, but some fundamental underlying logic remains the same. Let's look at the final paragraph, or the final two paragraphs of the late capitalism or industrial society, just to get a sense of where Adorno is coming from. Okay, so Adorno wrote, the idea that the forces and relations of production are one and the same today, and that the notion of society can be easily constructed solely by reference to the forces of production, is the current shape of socially necessary illusion, or socially necessary appearance. So this would be industrial society. It is socially necessary because elements of the social process that were formerly separate, and this includes living human beings, have been brought down to a kind of common denominator. Material production, distribution, and consumption are administered jointly. Their boundaries flow into one another. Even though earlier within the overall social process they were at once different from one another and related, and for that reason they respected what was qualitatively different. Everything is now one. The totality of the processes of mediation, which amounts in reality to the principle of exchange, has produced a second deceptive immediacy. This enables people to ignore the evidence of their own eyes and forget difference and conflict or repress it from consciousness. But this consciousness of society is illusion because while it does justice to the process of technological and organizational standardization, it overlooks the fact that this standardization is not fully rational but remains subject to blind irrational laws. No overall social subject exists. So this should recall the language of Horkheimer's Little Man in the Philosophy of Freedom, that the problem is not that the subject is not recognized, but that the subject does not exist. I should also say that rationality here, the Lukacs idea of means ends, reversal and means ends rationality, that society is rational in its means but not in its ends. That kind of Weberian idea that Lukacs took up and attributed more directly to Marx's description of how capitalism functions. No overall social subject exists. We could formulate this illusion by saying that all social phenomena today are so completely mediated that even the element of mediation is distorted by its totalizing nature. It is no longer possible to adopt a vantage point outside the hurly-burly that would enable us to give the horror a name. We are forced to adopt its inconsistencies as our starting point. And then he writes, this is what Horkheimer and I meant when we spoke some decades ago of the technological veil. So he brought that up in the Reflections on Class Theory. It's also to be found in their jointly written book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, written at the same time as Minima Moralia, whose sections we read. The false identity between the organization of the world and its inhabitants, an identity created by the expansion of technology, amounts to the affirmation of the relations of production, for whose beneficiaries we seek today almost as vainly as for the proletarians, who have become all but invisible. The system has become independent, even of those who are in control, but this process has now reached its limits. It has now become fate and finds its expression in what Freud called ubiquitous free-floating anxiety. Free-floating because it is no longer able to attach itself to living beings, whether to individuals or classes, But ultimately, what has been liberated are the relations between human beings that had been buried beneath the relations of production. Hence, the overpowering order of things remains its own ideology, and is thus virtually impotent. Impenetrable though its spell is, it is only a spell. If sociology is going to do anything more than provide agents and interests with the information that they want, if it is going to achieve anything of what was envisioned at its birth, right? In other words, addressing the problem of nihilism, of purposelessness in modern life, in modern society, it must face up to the task of employing methods that have not succumbed to universal fetishism, and thus make its contribution, however modest, to breaking the spell. Okay, so what he has in mind there is what used to be called in sociology qualitative versus quantitative methods. So quantitative methods are looking for statistical patterns, and qualitative methods focus more on subjective attitudes and understandings of people. So qualitative method of sociological research would involve interviewing people, and quantitative method would be more like questionnaires, kind of multiple choice questions, and then statistical compilation. So one way of thinking about it would be the quantitative appears to be more objective in character, and the qualitative seems more subjective in character. Right, the fact that trying to get a hold of what society is it an objective structure, or is it a matter of people's attitudes? Is it an objective phenomenon, or is it a subjective phenomenon? That kind of methodological dispute within sociology is itself, for Adorno, a phenomenon of capitalist contradiction. That it would be either or and not both. That it would either be subjective or objective. That it would either be qualitative or quantitative. And the difficulty of combining them. The difficulty of addressing it as both, as a matter of both, as something that could be studied qualitatively and quantitatively, and as a phenomenon that is both subjective and objective in nature and character. Right? The difficulty of that. But the difficulty of that is not just a problem of methodology, that the right methodology hasn't been found, but rather that the object of investigation is itself self-contradictory, society and capitalism, and that because of that, any way that one might seek to try to study it, to try to know it, would be subject to kind of antinomical self-contradiction. And any attempt to know capitalism is itself going to be beset by self-contradiction. Right. But he's not saying simply the impossibility of knowing society and capitalism. We should recall Lukacs. Lukacs had said, to understand capitalism would be tantamount to overcoming it. Right? To see how everything actually works together would be tantamount to overcoming it. Because once you had that perspective, it would mean that you had already achieved a practical perspective that would be tantamount to having overcome it. Right, so knowing the totality from within the totality, when the totality is one of self-contradiction, means knowing the totality in and through that self-contradiction. So if it's a totality of contradiction, then the only way it can be known is through that contradiction. Right, there's no outside standpoint from which to see the contradiction. You can only see the contradiction from within the contradiction, meaning looking at it from opposite sides. Okay, so keeping that in mind, this is hopefully going to help set us up for the other three readings we had for tonight on subject and object. marginalia to theory and praxis, and resignation. The former two of those, subject and object and marginalia, he called the dialectical epilegomena to the book Negative Dialectics that we were reading. Negative Dialectics was published in 1966, and then he found himself writing kind of postscripts, epilogues, epilegomena, to Negative Dialectics. Specifically, these two, on subject and object and marginality to theory and praxis, dialectical epilegomena to Negative Dialectics, motivated by questions and problems raised by the New Left, by the student movement, and by the crisis of the 1960s in particular. Generally, it's under the heading of theory and practice. So subject and object, one way of thinking about it, theory and practice, another way of thinking about it. I mentioned that Horkheimer and Adorno's conversation preparatory to rewriting the Communist Manifesto was published posthumously as a discussion about theory and practice. And we have already encountered that problem with Lukacs' theory of reification. So when we talked about reification, recall that reification is the reversion of the object to a thing that takes place when the dialectic of subject and object has broken down. When the dialectic of subject and object disintegrates, and that creates a reified consciousness. So reified theory, reified practice, if consciousness is both theoretical and practical. And reified subjectivity, thing-like subjectivity, a contemplative stance, separated. So it looks like subject and object are separated, their connection is broken. And this creates a phantom-like objectivity, meaning the object reverting to a thing doesn't mean that it just becomes a thing in the sense of a pre-objectified thing, but rather it's a post-objectified thing. It's an object that has reverted to a thing, which means it remains an object, it remains what the subject creates, but in a way the subject feels divorced from, cannot recognize itself in. And that's the phantom-like objectivity. And I think that I mentioned the phantom-like objectivity in Lukacs is related to Marx's commodity fetishism, the phantasmagoria, the smoke and mirrors of the capitalist world. All right, so we are seeing objects. We do understand that the objects appear to us as they do because of our activity as subjects, but we also can't recognize that reciprocal relationship or mutual mediation. We can't recognize that dialectical interplay and relation of subject and object. We can't recognize ourselves in it. We can't recognize the object in it. And if you recall I think that I hope that I sent you guys the link to the chart of terms that we had on reification when we were talking about Lukacs. Yeah, I did send that to you guys. All right, I think that that's where I want to leave us off before we take a short break now, and then we'll come back and look in more detail at these pieces. We're going to focus especially on marginality to theory and praxis and resignation. We'll talk a bit about subject and object, but we're going to focus most on marginalia and resignation. So let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and look at those pieces. Okay, let's resume. All right, I want to start with looking at on subject and object. And again, keeping in mind reification. So actually, maybe what I'll do is remind us of the reification concept. Just helping us visualize the dialectic of subject and object through the chart of terms that I shared with you guys. Talked about last week, and I posted to an announcement in Canvas. So dialectic of subject and object, again, it's a reciprocal relation. It's a mutual mediation, meaning you don't have the subject without the object, you don't have the object without the subject. Right, so the only way that we know the thing, we don't know it as a thing in itself, we only know it as a theoretical and practical object. And knowing the object, in theory and practice, means becoming a subject. That's what the subject is. So let's see how Adorno starts his essay on subject and object. So he writes, to lead in with reflections about subject and object raises the difficulty of stating what exactly the topic of discussion should be. The terms are patently equivocal. Thus, subject can refer to the particular individual as well as to the universal attributes of consciousness in general, in the language of Kant's prolegomena. The equivocation cannot be removed simply through terminological clarification. For both meanings have reciprocal need of each other, one can hardly be comprehended without the other. No concept of the subject can have the element of individual humanity, what Schelling called egoity, separated from it in thought. Without any reference to it, subject would lose all significance. Conversely, the particular human individual, as soon as one reflects upon it under the guise of the universality of its concept, which does not signify some particular being out of nothing, is already transformed into a universal, similar to what was expressed in the idealist concept of the subject. Even the expression particular person requires the concept of species simply in order to be meaningful. The relation of that universal still inheres implicitly in proper names. They designate someone who has such and such a name and no other, and someone stands elliptically for a person. On the other hand, if one wanted to escape complications of this kind by trying to define the two terms, then one would fall into an aporia, that a gap that attends the problematic of definition in modern philosophy since Kant. The concepts of subject and object, or rather what they refer to, have in a certain way priority over all definition. Defining means as much as subjectively, by means of a rigidly applied concept, capturing something objective, no matter what it may be in itself. Hence the resistance of subject and object to the act of defining. The determination of their meanings requires reflection on the very thing the act of defining truncates for the sake of conceptual manageability. Therefore, it is advisable to start by taking up the words subject and object such as they are handed down by the well-honed philosophical language of a historical sediment, not of course sticking to such conventionalism, but continuing further with a critical analysis. One could begin with the allegedly naive, though already mediated, view that a knowing subject, whatever kind it may be, stands confronting an object of knowledge, whatever kind it may be. The reflection, which in philosophical terminology goes by the name intentio obliqua, is then a relating from that ambiguous concept of object back to a no less ambiguous concept of subject. A second reflection reflects the first, more closely determining the vagueness for the sake of the contents of the concepts of subject and object. The separation of subject and object is both real and appearance, right, or phenomenal, semblance. True, because the realm of cognition it lends expression to, in the realm of cognition it lends expression to the real separation, the rivenness or the dividedness of the human condition, the result of a coercive historical process. Untrue, because the historical separation must not be hypostasized, not magically transformed into an invariant. In other words, because it was not always the case, it need not always be the case. This contradiction in the separation of subject and object is imparted to epistemology. Although as separated they cannot be thought away, I'm forgetting what this word is. It's something os. Is that the eidos?
It's pseudos.
What is it? Eidos?
Pseudos.
Pseudos. Oh. And, okay, so what does that mean? The falseness?
Yes.
The falseness of the separation is manifested in their being mutually mediated. Sorry, these scans are not OCR, so you can't like cut and paste. The pseudos of the separation is manifested in their being mutually mediated, object by the subject, and even more indifferently, subject by object. As soon as it is fixed without mediation, the separation becomes ideology, its normal form. Mind then arrogates to itself the status of being absolutely independent, which it is not. Mind's claim to independence announces its claim to domination. Once radically separated from the object, subject reduces the object to itself. Subject swallows object, forgetting how much it is object itself. The image of a temporal or extratemporal original state of blissful identity between subject and object is romantic, however. At times a wishful projection, today just a lie. Before the subject constituted itself, undifferentiatedness was the terror of the blind nexus of nature, and was myth. It was in their protest against this myth that the great religions had their truth content. After all, undifferentiatedness is not unity, for the latter requires, even according to the Platonic dialectic, diverse entities of which it is the unity. For those who experience it, the new horror of separation transfigures the old horror of chaos, and both are eternal sameness. The fear of gaping meaninglessness made one forget a fear that once was no less compelling, that of the vengeful gods. Epicurean materialism and the Christian fear not wanted to spare mankind. This cannot be accomplished except through the subject. Were it liquidated instead of sublated into a higher form, the result would not merely be regression of consciousness, but a regression to real barbarism. Fate, the complicity of myth with nature, comes from the total political immaturity of society, from an age in which self-reflection had not yet opened its eyes, in which subject did not yet exist. Instead of conjuring the return of this age through collective praxis, the captivating spell of the old undifferentiatedness should be obliterated. Its prolongation is mind's identity consciousness, which repressively makes its other like itself. Were speculation concerning the state of reconciliation allowed, then it would be impossible to conceive that state as either the undifferentiated unity of subject and object, or their hostile antithesis. Rather, it would be the communication of what is differentiated. Now, I want to say something about undifferentiatedness and differentiated. The differentiation. So the idea that difference is not prior, but the result. That difference is the product. So that it's produced. That we're creating difference rather than just originating as different. And so differentiation was, in the way Adorno is addressing it here, an emancipation. Right, so the differentiation of nature is also an emancipation within nature. So communication of what is differentiated. Only then would the concept of communication as an objective concept come into its own. The present concept is so shameful because it betrays what is best, the potential for agreement between human beings and things, to the idea of imparting information between subjects according to the exigencies of subjective reason. In its proper place, even epistemologically, the relationship of subject and object would lie in a peace achieved between human beings as well as between them and their other. Peace is the state of differentiation without domination, with the differentiated participating in each other. All right, so at this point I want to bring in the other chart of terms that we've had on capitalist contradiction, and then bring in what we had in the folder for today's reading, which is how Adorno is going to be addressing that contradiction in these essays. All right, so here's the chart of terms on capitalist contradiction that we've discussed earlier in the course. This is just to help us keep a bearing on the terms that we're using. So if you recall, Marx defined capitalism by its contradiction. So he seldom said capitalism, it's rather the capitalist mode of production. But the capitalist mode of production is defined by a contradiction. And that contradiction is the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. Another way of characterizing that contradiction is the contradiction of ideological superstructure and socioeconomic base. Yet another way, so a dialectic of base and superstructure, a dialectic of forces and relations of production. Another way of looking at it is the contradiction and the dialectic of social being and consciousness. Finally, consciousness, the ideological superstructure, and the social relations of bourgeois society are both practical and theoretical. They're primarily practical, and then they're theoretical. The theory is the reflection of the practice. So consciousness is both theory and practice. It isn't just theory. It's important. And social being, because social being changes, because social being is transformed historically. Social being, or the socioeconomic base, or the industrial forces of production, refer to the historical conditions of theory and practice. So the conditions that make theory and practice possible, and also the historical conditions that are transformed practically. And our consciousness of that transformation is through a consciousness characterized by a dialectic of theory and practice. Okay, so we had reification, the breakdown of the dialectic of subject and object. Now let's turn to the breakdown of the dialectic of theory and practice. Okay, so here I've laid out the terms that Adorno uses at the end of On Subject and Object that we'll turn back to, and in the marginalia on theory and praxis, and in resignation. Okay, so if we start with the consciousness and social being contradiction, if we start with the dialectic of social being and consciousness, and we look at that as consciousness both in theory and in practice. Consciousness, the Greek word for practice, is praxis, and the Greek word for theory is theoria. And the literal meaning of theory or theoria is how we see things, how we regard things, our perspective on things. So you have praxis and theory. You have both in consciousness, but in a contradiction of social being and consciousness. Okay, so what is our social being in capitalism? Well, our social being in capitalism is our social relations of labor. It is our practical relations. It's our relations with each other, relations with nature, and relations with ourselves. It's that complex of relations. The breakdown of bourgeois social relations in capitalism leads to the disintegration of subject and object. That also leads to the disintegration of theory and practice. So what does that look like? It looks like a reification of consciousness, reified consciousness, a reification of practice, and a reification of theory. So I mentioned that, a word like theory, like society or history, these words that end with a Y, are metaphysical objects, and isms tend to refer to a reified object, a reified metaphysical object. So, practice-ism, the reification of practice. The reification of practice that comes from its divorce from theory, its disintegration in consciousness from theoretical reflection. Right, so the dialectic of theory and practice becomes practice-ism, to use Adorno's language, and contemplation. So practice-ism is a kind of blind practice, and contemplation is a theory but divorced from practice. Right, so again, this is related to the contradiction, the disintegration of the dialectic, and therefore the contradiction of object and subject. Another way that Adorno addresses this is the contradiction, the disintegration of the particular and the universal. By the way, that would also be seen in particularism and universalism, the reification of the particular, the reification of the universal. We've also talked about this with respect to the commodity form, individualism and collectivism. Right, the breakdown of the dialectic of individual and collective brings about the reification of both in individualism and collectivism as kind of opposed antinomies, as opposed to dialectical opposites. All right, so that particularization of the object that is the symptom of a reification of praxis in a practice-ism. He also calls it action-ism. So the reification of action or acting into action-ism, which appears to be flatly opposed to thinking. So we'll see in the resignation essay, one of the phrases he has there is that thinking has the character of the universal. Right? Thinking comes from the subject isolated from the object, the subject forced into a contemplative stance, theory divorced from practice. becomes a matter of thinking as opposed to acting. So these appear to be flatly opposed. And that this is a kind of degradation. So a degradation of the dialectic of theory and practice would be the opposition of thinking and acting, in which you're either thinking or you're acting, where acting seems to be at the expense of thinking, and thinking seems to be at the expense of acting, of being able to act. Okay, so let's go back to our subject and object. Let's look at where he gets with that in the last aphorism, and how that leads into the marginalia on theory and practice. I'm going to start on the final page on 258. Here, I'll share my screen with you guys so we can look at this together. He says, nature at its lower stages is full of non-individuated organisms. If, as more recent biologists maintain, human beings in fact are born so much more ill-equipped than other creatures, then they probably could have survived only in association, through rudimentary social labor. The principium individuationis, the individual principle, is secondary to that. Hypothetically, a kind of biological division of labor. It is improbable that some single human first emerged archetypically. The belief in such an emergence mythically projects the principle of the individual, now historically fully developed, backward into the past, or onto the celestial realm of eternal ideas. The species may have individuated itself through mutation, in order then, through individuation, to reproduce itself in individuals by relying on biological singularity. Right, so even at a physical level, social individuation might be manifest. The human being is a result, not an eidos. I think that's the word. Not an origin. The insights of Hegel and Marx penetrate all the way into the inmost aspects of the so-called questions of constitution. The ideology of the human being, the model for the construction of the transcendental subject, is centered on the developed individual, as is indicated linguistically by the ambiguity in the article the definite article, which names the species as well as the individual. To this extent, nominalism, much more than its opponent ontology, includes the primacy of the species and of society. To be sure, ontology makes common cause with nominalism by at once denying the species, perhaps because it suggests animals. Ontology, by exalting the individual into the form of unity and into a being in itself, as opposed to the many. Nominalism, by unreflectedly proclaiming the individual on the model of the individual and of the human individual to be the true entity. It denies society and its concepts by degrading it into an abbreviation for the individual. All right, that takes some unpacking. So he brings in a concept here that I want to pause on, entity. And we've talked about identity and non-identity. We've talked about the non-identical in Adorno referring to the contradiction. So that would be to contrast entity and identity. So an easy way of thinking about this is in terms of the dialectic of being and becoming that we had early on in the course and throughout the course. So something is an entity Something is in the sense of being an entity, but it becomes identical to itself. Right, so the difference between entity and identity is that entity refers to being, whereas identity refers to becoming. So for something to become identical with itself, it would have to realize itself. Right, so self-identity is achieved. It's the transcendence of mere entity. Similarly, non-identity is something that becomes. It isn't simply something that is. Right, so non-identity would not be about different beings or different entities. It would be about a contradiction that develops. A self-contradiction that develops. That isn't there to begin with. So the eidos, the Greek word that we had, the form of something. Right, so it's a Platonic idea, the form of an entity. So I mentioned it as kind of originary. Right, so again, not something that becomes, but something that is. So the individual is not an entity, but an identity. The individual is the result, is the way he puts it. Of course, the subject is also a result, an effect, not a cause, a historical product, not an originating point. Right, so the human being might be an entity, might be a biological entity, might be a physical entity. But the social individual, right, the individual as such would be something that becomes identical to itself. Right, so that's why he uses the language of individuation. So becoming an individual, to individuate. Earlier we had differentiation, the differentiated. Becoming different, rather than just different entities. Becoming different, becoming non-identical. So becoming identical, becoming self-identical, also becoming non-identical. So I think that we talked about this in terms of transformation, the dialectic of being and becoming. Transformation being a process by which something can become new and different from what it was. Right, so becoming different. Self-differentiation. It's very different from heterogeneity. Heterogeneity means originating differently. Homogeneity means originating from the same. Heterogeneity means different in origination. Generated out of different sources. Homogeneity means generated from the same source. So not heterogeneity, but what he calls diverse multiplicity. So not starting out different, but becoming different, becoming differentiated. In the same way that there are individual human beings, but it's only in society that we become individuals. And so the difference between the human being and the social individual. Marx talked about this in the passage on the Grundrisse on production that we started out with in the week that we addressed Marx's critique of political economy, the first passage from the Grundrisse that we read on the individual as a historical product. Okay, so entity. So unity, right? Again, not pre-existing differentiation, but coming after differentiation. So unity coming after separation. We looked at it that way. So social unity comes out of and through social individuation, social differentiation of individuals. That's why he brings in the division of labor. All right, so we'll see how this is important when we transition now to marginality to theory and praxis. So we want to look at the first couple of paragraphs of that. He writes, a simple consideration of history demonstrates just how much the question of theory and praxis depends upon the question of subject and object. At the same time as the Cartesian doctrine of two substances ratified the dichotomy of subject and object, literature for the first time portrayed praxis as a dubious undertaking on account of its tension with reflection. Despite all its eager realism, pure practical reason is devoid of object to the same degree that the world, for manufacturing and industry, becomes material devoid of quality and ready for processing, which in turn finds its legitimation nowhere else but in the marketplace. Whereas praxis promises to lead people out of their self-isolation, praxis itself has always been isolated. For this reason, practical people are unresponsive, and the relation of praxis to its object is a priori undermined. Indeed, one could ask whether, in its indifference towards its object, all nature-dominating praxis up to the present day is not in fact praxis in name only. Its illusory character is inherited by all the actions unreflectedly adopting the old violent gesture of praxis. Since its beginnings, American pragmatism has been criticized, with good reason, for consecrating the existing conditions by making the practical applicability of knowledge its criterion for knowledge. Supposedly nowhere else could the practical effectiveness of knowledge be tested. If in the end theory... Oops. Okay, I'm actually in the wrong file. If in the end theory, the totality of it, if the totality of it does not want to remain futile, hold on. If in the end theory, which bears upon the totality, if it does not want to be futile, is tied down to its effectiveness here and now, then the same thing befalls it despite its belief that it escapes the immanence of the system. Theory steals itself back from the system's immanence only where it shirks its pragmatic fetters, no matter how modified they may be. All theory is gray, Goethe has Mephistopheles preach to the student he is leading around by the nose. The sentence was already ideology from the very beginning, fraud about the fact that the tree of life, the practitioners planted and the devil in the same breath compares to gold, is hardly green at all. Okay, so this is, theory is gray, but the tree of everlasting life is green. That's the phrase from Goethe, from Dr. Faustus, that he has Mephistopheles say. The grayness of theory is for its part a function of the life that has been dequalified. It's an awkward phrase. I guess maybe robbed of its qualitative character. Nothing should exist that cannot be fastened upon by both hands, not thought. The subject, thrown back upon itself, is divided from its other by an abyss, and is supposedly incapable of action. Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, is as much the protagonist, the proto-history of the individual in its subjective reflection as it is the drama of the individual paralyzed into inaction by that reflection. In his process of self-externalization towards what differs from him, the individual senses this discrepancy and is inhibited from completing the process. So what is he referring to here in Hamlet? So the soliloquy that Hamlet has when he's trying to make up his mind about what he should do, to be or not to be, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. Actually, what's meant there is to act or not to act. So he's Prince Hamlet. Who he is, what he is, as a prince, demands an action. So whether he acts or not will decide whether he is himself. Right, so to be or not to be is really a question of to act or not to act. Only a little later, the novel describes how the individual reacts to his situation, incorrectly termed alienation, as though the age before individualism enjoyed an intimacy which nonetheless can hardly be experienced other than by individuated beings. According to Burckhardt, animals are lonely communities, and with pseudo-activity. The follies of Don Quixote are the attempts at compensation for the lost other. In the language of psychology, they are restitution phenomena. Okay, so the novel, what he means by the novel, he doesn't mean the novel of Shakespeare's play Hamlet. He means the novel per se, the bourgeois novel, the novel as a form. And Don Quixote by Cervantes is one of the earliest examples of the modern novel. Right, so Don Quixote quixotic endeavors are understood as vain or ineffective or misguided actions. Right, so with both Don Quixote and Hamlet, we have the problem of action. What since then has been called the problem of praxis, and today culminates in the question of the relation between theory and praxis, coincides with the loss of experience caused by the rationality of the eternally same. So what is the rationality of the eternally same? Well, of course, that's the continuation, the maintenance, the reproduction of capitalism. Where experience is blocked or altogether absent, praxis is damaged and therefore longed for, distorted, and desperately overvalued. Thus, what is called the problem of praxis is interwoven with the problem of knowledge. Right, so epistemology, pure reason or understanding, is bound up with practical reason or praxis. Abstract subjectivity, in which the process of rationalization terminates. Again, that's a particular reason, but without rational ends. Strictly speaking, can do just as little as the transcendental subject can conceivably have precisely what it is attested to have, spontaneity. Right, so we've lost our knowledge of things, we've lost with our ability to spontaneously act. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. On the next page, a consciousness of theory and praxis must be produced that neither divides the two such that theory becomes powerless and praxis becomes arbitrary, nor refracts theory through the arch-bourgeois primacy of practical reason proclaimed by Kant and Fichte. Thinking is a doing. Theory is already a form of praxis, and already the ideology of the purity of thinking deceives about this. Thinking has a double character. It is imminently determined and rigorous, and yet an inalienably real mode of behavior in the midst of reality. To the extent that subject, the thinking substance of philosophers, is object, To the extent that it falls within object, subject is already also practical. The irrationality of praxis that continually resurfaces, however, its aesthetic archetype are the sudden random acts by which Hamlet carries out his plan, and in carrying it out fails, unceasingly animates the illusion of the absolute division between subject and object. Where knowledge is inveigled or kind of misled into believing that object is something absolutely incommensurable, the communication between the two becomes the prey of blind fate. He writes, it would be too coarse a generalization were one, for the sake of historico-philosophical construction, to date the divergence between theory and praxis as late as the Renaissance. But the divergence was first reflected upon only after the collapse of that ordo that presumed to allocate the truth as well as good works their place in the hierarchy. So the ordo, that's the medieval ordo, that's the caste system. That's the divine order of the great chain of being, of which the hierarchy of society was understood to be part. God's creation was hierarchical. God created things in a hierarchy. The crisis of praxis, with the collapse of the medieval ordo, the caste system, and the religious cosmology that it expressed, the crisis of praxis was experienced as not knowing what should be done. Together with the medieval hierarchy, which was connected to an elaborate casuistry, this is a kind of a reason as to why things are the way they are, the practical guidelines disintegrated, which at that time, despite all their dubiousness, seemed at least to be suitable to the social structure. The much-attacked formalism of Kantian ethical theory was the culmination of a movement that began irresistibly and through legitimate critique with the emancipation of autonomous reason. The inability to engage in praxis was first and foremost the consciousness of a lack of regulative principles, a weakness from the very beginning. From this weakness comes the hesitation, akin to reason in the guise of contemplation and the inhibition of praxis. The formal character of pure practical reason constituted its failure before praxis. To be sure, it also occasioned the self-reflection that leads beyond the culpable concept of praxis. If autarkic praxis has always manifested manic and compulsive traits, then self-reflection, on the other hand, signifies the interruption of action blindly directed outward, non-naivete as the transition to the humane. Whoever does not want to romanticize the Middle Ages must trace the divergence between theory and praxis back to the oldest division between physical and intellectual labor, probably as far back as prehistoric obscurity. Praxis arose from labor. It attained its concepts when labor no longer wanted to merely reproduce life directly, but to produce its conditions, and this clashed with the already existing conditions. Its descent from labor is a heavy burden for all praxis. To this day it carries the baggage of an element of unfreedom. The fact that once it was necessary to struggle against the pleasure principle for the sake of one's own self-preservation, although labor that has been reduced to a minimum no longer needs to be tied to self-denial. So labor reduced to a minimum, that's capitalism, in terms of the material necessity of it. Contemporary actionism also represses the fact that the longing for freedom is closely related to the aversion to praxis. Praxis was the reaction to deprivation. This still disfigures praxis even when it wants to do away with deprivation. To this extent, art is the critique of praxis as unfreedom. This is where its truth begins. With a shock, one can understand the abhorrence at the praxis so popular nowadays, when one observes natural historical phenomena such as beaver dams, the industriousness of ants and bees, or the grotesque struggles of the beetle as it carries a blade of grass. Modern and ancient intertwine in praxis. Once again, praxis becomes a sacred animal, just as in the time before recorded history, it was thought a sacrilege not to devote oneself body and soul to the efforts of preserving the species. The physiognomy of praxis is brute earnestness. This earnestness dissolves where the genius of praxis emancipates itself. This is surely what Schiller meant with his theory of play. So Schiller, in his letters on the aesthetic education of man, talks about the highest activity of freedom of humanity is play. The majority of actionists are humorless in a way that is no less alarming than are those who laugh along with everyone. The lack of self-reflection derives not only from their psychology, it is the mark of a praxis that, having become its own fetish, becomes a barricade to its own goal. The dialectic is hopeless. That through praxis alone it is possible to escape the captivating spell praxis imposes on people, but that meanwhile, as praxis, it compulsively contributes to reinforcing the spell. Obtuse, narrow-minded, at the farthest removed from spirit. The recent hostility towards theory, which animates this process, makes a program out of it. But the practical goal, which includes the liberation from all narrow-mindedness, is not indifferent to the means intended to achieve it. Otherwise, this dialectic would degenerate into vulgar Jesuitism. The idiotic parliamentarian in Doré's caricature who boasts, "Gentlemen, I am above all practical," reveals himself as a scoundrel who cannot see beyond the immediate tasks and moreover is proud of it. His behavior denounces the very spirit of praxis as a demon. Theory speaks for what is not narrow-minded. Despite all its unfreedom, theory is the guarantor of freedom in the midst of unfreedom. Let me see how we're doing for time here. It seems that maybe we're running low on time. Go to the end here and then turn to the resignation essay. So he says about his own work as a theoretician, wherever I have directly intervened in a narrow sense and with a visible practical influence, it happened only through theory. In the polemic against the musical youth movement and its followers, that was at the time of the Nazism, in the critique of the newfangled German jargon of authenticity, that's the sort of popularization of a lot of Heideggerian philosophy in German culture after World War II, a critique that spoiled the pleasure of a very virulent ideology by charting its derivation and restoring it to its proper concept. If these ideologies are in fact false consciousness, then their dissolution, which diffuses widely in the medium of thought, inaugurates a certain movement towards political maturity, and that, in any case, is practical. The stale Marxist pun about critical critique, the witlessly pleonastic hackneyed witticism that believes theory is annihilated because it is theory, merely conceals the insecurity involved in the direct translation of theory into praxis. And even later, despite the Internationale, the First International, with whom he had a falling out, Marx by no means surrendered himself to praxis. Praxis is a source of power for theory, but cannot be prescribed by it. It appears in theory merely, and indeed necessarily, as a blind spot, as an obsession with what is being criticized. No critical theory can be practiced in particular detail without overestimating the particular. But without the particularity, it would be nothing. This admixture of delusion, however, warns of the excesses in which it incessantly grows. Let's see how we're doing. Did we run out our clock? Not exactly, but almost. Let's look at Resignation, the final essay that he wrote. So this is in response to the criticism that he and Horkheimer and others, Habermas, had received by the students. It says, we older representatives of what the name Frankfurt School has come to designate have recently and eagerly been accused of resignation. We had indeed developed elements of a critical theory of society, the accusation runs, but we were not ready to draw the practical consequences from it. And so, we neither provided an actionist program, nor did we even support actions by those who felt inspired by critical theory. It says, I will not address the question of whether that can be demanded from theoretical thinkers, who are relatively sensitive and by no means shock-proof instruments. The purpose that has fallen to them in a society based on the division of labor may be questionable. They themselves may be deformed by it, but they are also formed by it. Of course, they could not by sheer will abolish what they have become. So remember what Adam Smith had said about the division of labor, the specialization, making human beings as narrow and stunted as possible. I do not want to deny the element of subjective weakness, he writes, that clings to the narrowed focus on theory. He says that he thinks the objective side of it is more important. The objection, effortlessly rattled off, runs along these lines. The person who at this hour doubts the possibility of radical change in society, and who therefore neither participates in spectacular violent actions nor recommends them, has resigned. What he has in mind, he thinks cannot be realized. Actually, he doesn't even want to realize it. By leaving the conditions untouched, he condones them without admitting it. Let me jump out here. Right, pseudo-activity is generally the attempt to rescue enclaves of immediacy in the midst of a thoroughly mediated and rigidified society. Such attempts are rationalized by saying that the small change is one step in the long path towards the transformation of the whole. The disastrous model of pseudo-activity is the do-it-yourself, the DIY. Activities that do what has long been done better by the means of industrial production, only in order to inspire in the unfree individuals, paralyzed in their spontaneity, the assurance that everything depends on them. The nonsense of do-it-yourself in the production of material goods, even in the carrying out of many repairs, is patently obvious. Admittedly, the nonsense is not total. With the reduction of so-called services, sometimes measures carried out by the private person that are superfluous considering the available technology nonetheless fulfill a quasi-rational purpose. The do-it-yourself approach in politics is not completely of the same caliber. The society that impenetrably confronts people is nonetheless these very people. The trust in the limited action of small groups recalls the spontaneity that withers beneath the encrusted whole, or the encrusted totality, and without which this totality cannot become something different. The administered world has the tendency to strangle all spontaneity, or at least to channel it into pseudo-activities. At least this does not function as smoothly as the agents of the administered world would hope. However, spontaneity should not be absolutized, just as little as it should be split off from the objective situation or idolized the way the administered world itself is. Ahead, even political undertakings can sink into pseudo-activities, into theater. It is no coincidence that the ideals of immediate action, that's direct action, by the way, even the propaganda of the deed, that's the old anarchist idea of the propaganda of the deed, have been resurrected after the willing integration of formerly progressive organizations that now in all countries of the earth are developing the characteristic traits of what they once opposed. So what he has in mind here are the socialist and communist parties becoming institutions of the capitalist status quo in the 20th century. Yet this does not invalidate the critique of anarchism, he says. Its return is that of a ghost. The impatience with theory that manifests itself in its return does not advance thought beyond itself. By forgetting thought, the impatience falls back below it. This is made easier for the individual by his capitulation to the collective with which he identifies himself. He is spared from recognizing his powerlessness. The few become the many in their own eyes. We jump further ahead. At this time, he writes, no higher form of society is concretely visible. For that reason, whatever acts as though it were in easy reach has something regressive about it. But according to Freud, whoever regresses has not reached his instinctual aim. Objectively, regression is renunciation, even when it thinks itself the opposite and innocently propagates the pleasure principle. By contrast, the uncompromisingly critical thinker, who neither signs over his consciousness nor lets himself be terrorized into action, is in truth the one who does not give in. Thinking is not the intellectual reproduction of what already exists anyway. As long as it doesn't break off, thinking has a secure hold on possibility. So again, the non-identity of theory and practice, the separation of theory and practice is emancipatory, as he wrote in the Marginality to Theory and Praxis, because it shows that there's a possibility that is not yet actualized in the way things are. So again, the dialectic of what is and what ought to be is expressed by the dialectic of theory and practice. As long as it doesn't break off, thinking has the secure hold on possibility. Its insatiable aspect, its aversion to being quickly and easily satisfied, refuses the foolish wisdom of resignation. The utopian moment in thinking is stronger the less it, this too a form of relapse, objectifies itself into a utopia, and hence sabotages its realization. Open thinking points beyond itself. For its part, a comportment, a form of praxis, it is more akin to transformative praxis than a comportment that is compliant for the sake of praxis. Prior to all particular content, thinking is actually the force of resistance, from which it has been alienated only with great effort. Such an emphatic concept of thinking admittedly is not secured, not by the existing conditions, nor by ends yet to be achieved, nor by any kinds of battalions. Whatever has once been thought can be suppressed, forgotten, and can vanish. But it cannot be denied that something of it survives. For thinking has the element of the universal. What once was thought cogently must be thought somewhere else, by others. This confidence accompanies even the most solitary and powerless thought. Whoever thinks is not enraged in all his critique. Thinking has sublimated the rage. Because the thinking person does not need to inflict rage upon himself, he does not wish to inflict it on others. The happiness that dawns in the eye of the thinking person is the happiness of humanity. The universal tendency of oppression is opposed to thought as such. Thought is happiness, even where it defines unhappiness, by enunciating it. By this alone, happiness reaches into the universal unhappiness. Whoever does not let it atrophy has not resigned. So he's turning the accusation of resignation back against the accusers and saying that their hostility to thinking, their hostility to theory, is actually evidence of their resignation. That they've resigned from actually changing the world in favor of pseudo-activity. And he says, even political action can degenerate into pseudo-activity, can become theater. And this is the time of that. The 60s is the birth of kind of protest demonstration type activism. Right. So there's actually a phrase from Walter Benjamin, who was, again, as we've discussed, a friend and mentor, a teacher of Adorno's, from his work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which you guys might have read in other classes. Benjamin says that fascism gives the masses a chance to express themselves without changing social conditions. So expressing yourself without being able to change the world. That's the kind of fascist formula for what Benjamin called the aestheticization of politics. So what does the aestheticization of politics mean? It means that politics becomes a realm of feeling, right, of expressing feeling rather than changing things. That's why Adorno brings in Freud and failure to realize an instinctual aim, right? So, and the rage involved in practicism or actionism, as he refers to it in the Marginalia to Theory and Praxis and Resignation. Right, so he's defending thinking as a sublimation, as a sublimated rage, as opposed to an enactment of it, an acting out of it, which is what he sees in actionism and practicism. Earlier in the essay, in a passage that we didn't look at, he basically addresses the fact that the student left at this time, was turning in on itself. That basically the students were attacking each other, were condemning each other. Right? That's what happened out of the frustration at the inability to change the world. The movement kind of consumed itself, turned against itself, and he fell victim to that as well. So the last year of his life, Adorno was protested by the students. He was protested especially because the students tried to occupy the Frankfurt School. They tried to occupy the institute itself, which was this little building in a corner of the university. Because the students violently occupied the building, Adorno was afraid that some kind of physical altercation would break out between the student occupiers and the people working there, so he called the police. And because he called the police, of course, he was condemned by the students for siding with the state against the students. And so, of course, they turned up the heat of protesting him, and they protested a lecture that he was giving. And basically, at that protest, they declared that Adorno as an institution is dead, and then they mobbed him at the lectern at the front of the lecture hall, and women took their shirts off and rubbed their breasts onto Adorno's body in order to try to embarrass him. Europeans. They go topless without much embarrassment. It's different from America. It's different from the Anglo world. And Adorno broke off the teaching for the rest of the semester. He went away on vacation. He went hiking in the Alps with his wife, and he overexerted himself and had a heart attack and died. And as it turned out, this resignation essay, it was not intended to be his last writing, but it was his last writing before he died. It was the last thing he wrote and sent for publication before he died, while on vacation. He was also hiking in the Alps, in the part of the Alps that Nietzsche had enjoyed hiking in, specifically. So the specific area of the mountains where Nietzsche used to enjoy hiking was also a place that Adorno had visited many times. So he was hiking where Nietzsche used to hike, except Nietzsche came down from his hike and had a mental breakdown when he saw a horse being beaten. and then spent the rest of his life in a semi-catatonic state, whereas Adorno had a heart attack and died, which is probably a little bit better than what happened to poor Nietzsche. All right, so actionism, practicism, politics degenerating into pseudo-activity and theater, and this affecting the left most of all, and among people who want to change the world, and in that way, miming, imitating, reproducing the unreality of the capitalist political world. Right, so the danger there is that people who oppose the capitalist political world might end up doing the same thing as the capitalist political world, engage in a kind of theatrics. He says, for the sake of publicity, that action is done for the sake of publicity, right, where the publicity is an end in itself. Where it's understood, well, of course, this isn't going to actually change anything, but at least our voices are heard. That really dominated the practice on the left for a very long time. It might still. But certainly through most of my lifetime, it dominated the protest demonstration mode of activity. Hopefully it can be transcended. But a lot of what Adorno wrote about in 1969 has remained the case, or at least remained the case for a very long time. Whether it's still the case, we have yet to see. We have yet to see about the effectiveness of our praxis, of our practice. But still, a lot of the motivation is still recognizable. Rage at inability to change the world. All right, I know I've kept you guys a little bit late. So I will look forward to your papers next week. Enjoy the break, as brief as it is. It's actually a longer break between now and the fall semester than we've gotten in the past. And I will see some of you in future classes. And in the meantime, take good care, take it easy, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Okay, bye guys.
Thank you.